Hi everyone. Again, thanks for your good work this semester. And as we begin working through Exodus 19, Exodus 20, and now in the next piece we're going to look at Exodus 21 and these assignments, we're essentially looking at the snapshot of the Sinai covenant. Now, if you look in the book of Exodus and go look at the Pentateuch, the Sinai materials actually cover from Exodus 19, when Israel gets to Sinai, all the way until Numbers 10:10, when Israel departs Sinai and then begins to head to the Promised Land again. That's a lot of scripture. So that's the entire book of Leviticus, the majority of the book of Exodus, and about the first third of the book of Numbers, roughly. So that's a huge chunk of the Pentateuch just takes place at Sinai. Now, if you want to talk about the Sinai covenant in a snapshot, it's really Exodus 19 to 24, and there we see the covenants laid out fairly clearly with announcement of who God is, what God's expectations are, what God expects of the people, what God's done, and then Israel actually agreeing to go along with God's and participate in God's covenant. What I want to show you in this quick video is to set out the law in the context, in the structural flow of this, so you can see a little bit about how the Scriptures invite us to reflect ethically on what's going on. Now, what we see in Exodus 19 and going forward is what you know from inductive Bible study is as a particularization, with the general statement being Exodus 19, 3 to 6, where we saw some key words, right? We saw that God invites Israel to what? A covenant. And to be a kingdom of priests. And a holy nation. Now, we talked already about what that looks like, that what essentially God's calling them to be is a missional community that reflects God's character to, for, and in the world. Okay? And embodied in covenant here, and notice broadly, God doesn't give any specifics about what God meant with the word covenant here in terms of demands. We just get this vocation that they're going to have. They accept God's covenant. They truly hear God's voice and keep the covenant. Out of all the nations, again, remember, they're called into this covenant for the sake of the world. Don't ever miss that. The gospel comes to us on its way to somebody else. The gospel comes to us on its way to some other place. We're blessed to be a blessing. That's the movement throughout Scripture. An experience of God's grace is never an end in itself just for the recipient. We're blessed so that we can extend God's blessing to other people. And we see that even in this covenant materials here. So we're blessed to be a blessing. So embedded in this, we see kingdom of priests, holy nation, which embodies three key core principles: mission, community, and holiness. So that's great. You say, sign me up. I want to be part of a missional community that reflects God's character to, for, and in the world. Okay, great. Well, what does that look like? Well, Scripture begins to help us to see that even in the book of Exodus through a particularization. I'm going to draw it this way. So it starts out general and it moves to the particulars. And we'll have to move this camera around a little bit to capture all this. But essentially we have the general statement. And that general statement is Exodus 19, 3 to 6. And then Exodus 20 through 23 essentially unpacks that in two different movements. So we're going to basically have kind of a double particularization. The first element that gets as we get to some specifics, in the initial particularization of this, the particulars starts out with the Ten Commandments. So this is immediately after Exodus 19, we get Exodus 20, 1 to 17, which gives and provides us a snapshot of what this looks like. What does it mean to be God's people? And as we already talked about, we have two sets of commands, essentially. Again, we have the reminder of God's grace. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And don't ever forget that for Jewish people, that's the first commandment. Again, you can look at the class notes to see how three different styles of breakdowns exist for those 10 commandments, right? They're the same words, but there's three different ways of actually coming up with 10. Our Jewish friends, they say that the first commandment is, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That's the first commandment. But regardless, that anchors this whole thing in grace again. But essentially, the commands can be broken down into love God, love neighbor, with the bridge between these two pieces being Sabbath. So that's the 10 commandments, right? And so they give us a snapshot, but again, there's a lot left for interpretation there, right? I mean, what does it mean to not have other gods before the Lord? What's it look like to not have idols? What does it look like not to kill? And what if I accidentally kill somebody? Does that mean I broke the 10 commandments? What does it mean to steal? What if my ox gores someone and they die? So there's lots of potential questions that arise. And so in a sense, the 10 commandments, they're both a more specific way of talking about what it means to keep God's covenant, but the 10 commandments themselves are powerful in the sense that they're timeless, but in a sense their timeless quality is partially true because of their generalness, the broadness of what they say. They demand some additional reflection, and this is where I want you to see as we move into other sections. And this is going to be our last legal section in Exodus. But the next piece right comes after this. And in fact, Exodus 19:3, if you remember, said, "You yourselves have seen." Right? Notice that phrase happens again in 20:22. The Lord said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites." Sounds like 19:3. And then just sounds like, here's what it sounds like 19:4. "You yourselves have seen." That's 2022, so it restarts this. And now from 2022 all the way through 23, we get what's called the Book of the Covenant. So 2022 all the way through Exodus 23 is the Book of the Covenant. And these are the hard laws. These are the laws that we don't always know what to do with because they're so specific. And so, I always joke that these are some of my favorite laws because I never break them. I never boil baby goats in its mother's milk. I've never done that. My ox never gores anybody. So I love these laws because I don't break them, right? Well, not so fast, right? Well, because what we have here is a mode of ethical reflection that moves from very broad statements to some particulars. And the Book of the Covenant gives us an example of how to apply broad principles of Scripture into specific situations. And so the Book of the Covenant, we're not going to live holy missional lives by making sure our oxes don't gore people. But there's principles underneath there that we need to embody, right? These show us how to be in the world and not of it, how to reflect God's character. And so this gives us a mode that shows us that if we're going to be God's people in the world, we need to figure out within our specific context how to apply these broad principles. I teased that out in that video, how to read the 10 Commandments missionally. Okay, again, this isn't a call for legalism, but this is a call just to see how this particularization works, that Israel's law moved from broad statements about listening to God all the way down to some very specific ways in which Israel, in its context, was expected to live it out. So again, just notice this in your work, how the broader structure, sometimes it's important to step back and see the big picture as we're boring down into the real details, which is what this Hebrew exegesis class is about. Again, if you have any questions, I look forward to more conversation, and have a wonderful day. Thanks.